I am not a millennial. I am Gen X. And so I am going to do my best to share my screen in a reasonable and coherent way right now. So we're going to see how this goes. Um, and my main thing would be, can you see the PowerPoint? So you can give me a thumbs up or you can say something in the chat to let me know
For sure.
whether, yeah, you can see it.
Got it.
Okay, fantastic. Because I cannot necessarily see y'all this moment in time. I can see the PowerPoint, but I can't necessarily see you. So don't be afraid to jump in at any moment with a comment or a question. So I am calling this presentation News from Poems, but also Poems from the News. And in a second, I'll explain a little bit about where this title comes from. But I wanted to introduce myself to you a little bit in terms of how the idea for this workshop came about. And so the idea for this workshop came about for a couple of reasons. One of which being that I am a high school teacher, and I have been a high school teacher for almost 27 years now, so more than half my life. And when my students are sort of examining how they're going to be out in the world, they often find themselves kind of overwhelmed by current events, kind of overwhelmed by the world that they are inhabiting. And so I started trying to find ways for them to engage with current events in ways that made current events seem to them manageable, interesting, fascinating, as they should be, and also a source of inspiration rather than a source of despair. Another reason for my interest in this particular topic is that for about 15 years, I was a journalism teacher, and I've worked as a freelance journalist off and on all my professional life. And I know that the profession is considered to be in peril at this moment in time. But it is a profession for which I have great, great respect. And many of my favorite authors, poets, and novelists have come from the field of journalism. And so I feel like journalism has a lot to teach poets in terms of storytelling, and how journalists move through the world may well be how poets should move through the world as well. So those are some of the reasons for my interest in this. And that is me standing at Fort Mose. And I practiced this presentation a little bit with my high school students earlier today, and they were like, that is an iconic headshot. And I said, thank you. My 13-year-old daughter took it. So, you know, it's always a good thing to have the perspective of the youth one way or another. So the title for the workshop comes from a very famous quote by William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And William Carlos Williams also said that poetry was an echo dancing with a shadow. And so just as that definition of poetry is elusive, I think the meaning of this quotation can also be elusive. But here's what I get when I look at this quotation. And for those of you who, I'm sure everybody does know William Carlos Williams, but for those of you who don't, I found this really great kind of meta picture of his very famous poem about the red wheelbarrow that's actually painted on a wheelbarrow. So Jennifer Wolf, I just want to say that for your garden, I think this is a thing that should be happening in your garden at some point. So when a red wheelbarrow appears in your garden, Jennifer, with this poem painted on it, you will know that it is me that did it. But here's some of the things that I think that quotation means. One of the things that quotation is suggesting is considered to be full of facts, and poems are not usually considered to be full of facts. Poems usually kind of rank under news, and because people will say that we need the news, but people very rarely say, at least in the outer world, that we need poems. Poets will say it, but not everybody will. And people will also say that poems are harder to read than the news. And at the same time, people will get themselves, you know, in the recognition that a lot of times, because of the content, the news is, you know, in a lot of ways, emotionally, intellectually, psychically harder to read than poems. And in the end, what I think that William Carlos Williams is asking is that we have kind of a balance, that we are out in the world, that we are reading the news, we are engaging, but that we are also making sure to honor our emotional selves, our spiritual selves, ourselves as individuals moving through overwhelming events. And so ultimately, we need both. We need the news in one hand and we need poems in the other. And in that way, we read the world better and we read ourselves better. One of the things to think about with this workshop and a mindset that I'm hoping to encourage in you all as writers and as participants in this workshop is the mindset of the bricoleur. And so a bricoleur is a word where it comes from France, and the definition has kind of changed over time, but it really did originally mean a craftsman who worked with bricks, who created spaces, out of bricks, architecturally speaking. But over time, it came to mean that a bricoleur is somebody who makes use of whatever materials are at hand, regardless of their original purpose. So a bricoleur sees a can cover a lid and also sees a hole in the wall. And the bricoleur says, hey, I can use this lid to cover the hole in the wall. And the bricoleur turns a whole lot of neckties into a skirt. And the bricoleur is very open to whatever is in the world, is always wandering around, picking up useful things and kind of stitching them together into new creations. So when I think about why you can get poems from the news, one of the sort of mindsets I want to encourage is the mindset of being the bricoleur and just being really open as you move through the world, as you're driving around, which in Jacksonville, we do a lot of driving around, listening to the radio. You are always picking up little bits and tidbits that you can sort of store and stitch into poems. And so one of the things that I hope to do in this workshop is share with you kind of that bricoleur mindset. To go along with that bricoleur mindset and to go along with the news from poems, you can steal a lot just from the structure, the journalistic structure of storytelling can go to poems. And everybody knows that journalists tend to tell their story in inverted pyramid style with the most important facts at the top and then the sort of the lesser details at the bottom. But there are other sort of forms of storytelling, which include the martini glass and also the kebab format. And just looking at the way that Tim Harrower, who is a journalist for the Oregonian, describes creating a story and describes creating a story with a juicy red tomato and then the meat and then, another tomato. And that makes me think of kind of the craft that's involved with creating poems, where you are maybe starting with a really vivid and precise anecdote. And then you maybe do need some explanation, some context. You need to maybe talk about kind of emotions in a more abstract way. But then you come back again to that really juicy, meaty anecdote. And it is that balance of idea or thought and concrete detail that makes a really good news story and makes a really good poem. So here's our agenda as we go. I do want to check in on the chat and see how folks are doing. I'm working on seeing the chat, which is maybe not doing super well for me right now. In fact, I'm having a hard time seeing the chat. And I'm not sure.
Anna, at the top, you should see.
There we go. I got it.
All right. Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So absolutely to Michael and also to Jennifer, and to Jennifer, I think one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about journalism is the idea that people are always like, oh, journalism is in so much crisis now. There's so much fake news. And from the minute that there was journalism, there was fake news. Town criers in medieval times were getting bribed to say that bad wine was good wine while they ran around town, calling out for wares. And one thing to respond to when people say that journalism is in crisis now is to say, it's never been more transparent. And there have never been so many innovative ways of storytelling right now. So I know we think about the golden age of journalism as being, Edward R. Murrow, and all that good stuff. But I think, we might in some ways be entering a second golden age of journalism. And that shine kind of trickles down to the poets because there is so much inventive storytelling going on out there. So Kara Lewis, who is a journalist, talks about, again, that kind of possible interweave of poetry and journalism. And today, some of the ways that I want to share with you that I pull inspiration for poems would include headlines, Car notes, which is going to make sense in a minute. Playing around with the archives of newspapers, looking to columnists and opinion editorial writers, and also doing kind of an interesting kind of dive into surveys. And so that is where we are going at this moment in time. Now, if this will let me go to my next thing, which it will not. So I am now trying to get to my next slide on the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. I wanted to start with a poem by Frank O'Hara, who wrote a series of poems called Lunchtime Poems, and they were very, very focused in the facts of the world. And I was wondering if I could ask some people to unmute and do some reading. So Ruth, if you're still with us, would you unmute and read the first stanza of this poem?
Yeah.
And Jennifer, could I get you to read the second stanza that ends with quandariness, and then we will go to the next page. And while they're reading, I encourage you guys to use the chat to type in the lines, the words and phrases of this poem that really, really stick with you. And if this is a familiar and beloved poem to you, great. If this is not a familiar and beloved poem to you, meet Frank O'Hara, who's amazing. So Ruth, if you could take it away.
The Day Lady Died by Frank O'Hara. It is 12:20 in New York on Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine because I will get off the 4:15 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me.
I walk up the muggy street, beginning to sun, and have a hamburger and a malted, and buy an ugly New World Writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod, Trans Richmond Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or La Passion, or Les Nègres of Gannett, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with quandariness.
And Darlin, can you do the next stanza?
Yes, I will. I was typing a line in the chat, so now I am here. And for Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega. And then I go back where I came from to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater and casually ask for a carton of Galois and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it.
And I am sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron and everyone, and I stopped breathing. And the image that is there is the cover of the New York Post, recognizing the day that Billie Holiday passed away. And it is the inspiration for this lunchtime poem by Frank O'Hara. And for me, there are 2 lines in particular that I think are important for getting the news from poems. And one of them is in the first stanza where O'Hara says, "And I don't know who will feed me." And that kind of goes back to the idea of being a bricoleur and always being open to new ways to feed your soul, to feed your mind, to feed your artistic self. And then for me, the most important line in the poem is, "And then I go back where I came from," because he's talking about a kind of a geographical travel within the city. He's talking about your daily errands and your routines, but he's also talking about his artistic self, his poet self, and going back to a moment where he saw a transcendent performer transform the audience and transform you know, people on an emotional and spiritual and psychic level. And it is from that headline that he is able to go into that journey through space and time and history and his own history. So I'm going to go check into the chat and see, and there we go. I don't know the people who will feed me. Buy an Ugly New World Writing. And that talks to so many different and exciting things that were happening in the culture. Beginning to Sun. Yeah, it's such a great image, right? And there's the muggy street too that spoke to both Aja and Chris. Yeah, Michael, it's absolutely not just literal, right? But it's those literal details that let you kind of enter into the story and then go beyond the literal. So with that in mind, and with Frank O'Hara in mind, I wanted to give you guys several writing invitations for this particular workshop. And so these are things that if you are taking notes, you might want to write down. One of the things about being a bricoleur is that you have to be a little bit patient about gathering your materials and waiting to see where your creation is going to go. So with that in mind, some of the writing invitations that I have for you all are maybe not things that you can do in 5 minutes, things they might take some work to put together. But this is one that you can at least start, and you can absolutely put this in the chat, and that would be great. A thing to think about is events, and these can be broad historical events, wars or sudden, you know, inventions or foods that sort of come onto the scene. Movies, things like that. They can also be small local events like fires or the opening of a church or a place. And a thing to think about is to go back in time a little bit and think about the year of your birth. I found that this is kind of a productive exercise. If you start with things that happened when you entered the world, they entered the world and you entered the world at the same time. And those things have shaped your life. You can also think about events that happened in your parents' lives or your grandparents' lives and think about how they shaped your life. So for example, for me, I was born in 1970, and 1970 is one of the years of the Apollo 13 moon landing and its successful return. But another thing that's important in 1970 is that that was the first Earth Day celebration. And that sort of consciousness of the environment and ecology has shaped my entire life. So a game to play on another level as a bricoleur is to think about a news story from that time and think about how it has shaped your current life. You can also think about things that are happening in the moment. So for Frank O'Hara, it was the loss of somebody who had shaped his life. So you can think about it in terms of that as well. The image that is here on the page is actually a palimpsest map of Cambridge in England. And the idea behind this palimpsest map is that it is talking about the idea that, you know, the structure of the city a long time ago shaped the structure of the city all the way up until now. And that is also a way to think of news and current events in history as this palimpsest that is shaping all the time. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to think in the chat about event, and you can type into the chat events that, whether they happened when you were young or they happen now, or they happened when your parents or your grandparents were alive, that you feel like are shaping events, whether they shaped you as an artist or a person. So take a few minutes to think about that. And if you're willing, please post in the chat. Oh, wow. Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that, Shalini. That's a very intense and powerful thing to share. That is the same place in different eras overlaid. And from what I understand about that picture, it is kind of the outskirts of Cambridge proper, sort of moving out into what have become the suburbs of Cambridge. So Jim, that's what I understand about that particular image. This is a question that I ask my students as well. And they do, just as PJ mentioned, they do talk about how profound our most recent presidential elections have been. In terms of how they merge them visually, Jim, it's my understanding that they started out with paper maps and then they moved on into satellite and then drone photos. Okay, the Woolworth sit-ins, a gas shortage. Oh, wow, that's a great story. Yeah, there you go. Those moments of recognition, darling, yours have both had a theme about kind of those moments of recognition of a place or a person. Oh, wow. Okay. Fantastic details. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And then a thing to think about, Ruth, is how in some way, if you go back and look at news stories about the Great Depression, how in some way you might be able to recognize some of the patterns of your own life too. So that's something that my husband says. Oh, Mrs. Doubtfire. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, scientific things and pop culture things are also huge and often things that many, many people can talk to. So those are great details. And I hope they maybe start with some kind of inspiration. In terms of headline inspiration, I wanted to show you another way. This is kind of a form of found poetry, and this is in a recent issue of The Atlantic, where somebody followed a news story. And this is an interesting thing to think about with news stories, is that there's news stories and then there's follow-up news stories. And so here is a writer who took a news story, which is the idea of Australia sort of struggling with these invasive cane toads, and focused on the first time that the cane toads were sort of recognized as an issue. And then by collecting headlines, manages to tell a story that's pretty gruesome, also pretty vivid. And within that story and within that series of headlines, the cane toads become kind of more and more of a force, more and more of a personality. And in the end, I think more and more of a metaphor for how we are currently living, with nature and viewing nature often as a threat or something that needs to be controlled. So that's an interesting and kind of a bricoleur writing exercise for you, is to find a story and sort of track that story over time. This is particularly interesting sometimes with sports, if sports are your thing. For me, the Kentucky Derby is my thing. And so I often will sort of track, the Kentucky Derby stories from the beginning of the race season to the end of the race season, and see how things have maybe come to triumph or sometimes come to tragedy. So some other things to think about in terms of headline inspiration are to use a headline as a jumping off point for an idea, and also keep an eye out when you're looking at headlines or the first lines of news stories. Look out for inadvertent mistakes or typos. So sometimes headlines that have gone wrong are truly amazing. And I can think of several, but many of them are kind of inappropriate, and I didn't throw them into a PowerPoint. But this is a typo that I found in the New York Times in 1989. And it was the very first line of a news story, and they had messed up the spacing. And so it reads, "He knows she's dead now, but because of the position of the S in the middle there, maybe he knows he's dead now. And maybe her passing affected his life." And it's just a really flexible and interesting sentence. And that came out of the newspaper and generated a poem. And then the other thing that I looked at today when I was sort of scanning the New York Times on my phone is they had one of the subheadlines that said "crosswords for beginners." And just with kind of that bricoleur's mind, I thought, what if you put a space between cross and words, and it was more about crosswords, like angry words, like having a fight, and what it might be to teach people what it's like when people sort of begin to learn to fight. Again, I have a 13-year-old, and she's having all sorts of friend drama, and she's kind of figuring out how to handle and resolve conflict. So I thought that was an interesting way and maybe a seed for a poem. So here's your second writing invitation. And one thing to think about as a writing invitation is to think about an event in your life or an event that you've wanted to write a poem about, and think about it in terms of headline structure. So I know that every once in a while when I'm about to do something stupid, I imagine the headline, local teacher drives car through grocery store. And sort of imagine my life as a news story and narrated in headline format. And it does bring a kind of a different energy to the topic. Think about a headline, and for those of you who are here online, you could maybe hit your phones real quick. You could maybe hit Google real quick and think about a headline that sort of hits you as an interesting first line of a poem. Another thing, and that's what's down there at the bottom, where it talks about the idea of the new historical museum, wonder and awe at the new wing, and it's the wing in architecture, but that also butterflies too. And so I kind of had an idea when I looked at that. I imagined like butterflies kind of clustering around to evaluate architecture, which leads to option 3. If you look at a news story, think about who's affected by that news story beyond the people that are in the first 3 paragraphs of that news story. And think about whose voice you could bring in. And last but not least, for option 4, think about going beyond the front page. A lot of times when people are looking at the news, they scan the front page for the big headlines, but they don't necessarily spend time in the arts section or the leisure section or the travel section. And there are some great and amazing stories in there and some great and amazing writing in there, and definitely some things to look at. So
And a
again,
quick question.
yeah.
I know what's meant by SVO, and SVO is a way of English, but could you explain with the headline a little more specifically what you're getting at? There's a headline and whatnot with the SVO structure
Yeah,
for a
absolutely.
poem.
Absolutely. So the main thing is that it's subject, verb, object. And one of the conventions of news stories is that your headline kind of goes across the length of your story. So if your story is 3 columns long, your headline is also only going to be 3 columns long. And in order to make headlines fit into that limited space, one of the conventions of headline writing is that people tend to drop the articles. So it becomes this very, very sort of intense, compacted. So instead of saying the criminal stole the beer from the liquor store, it's, criminal steals cases from store. And it gets this kind of energy to it. So that, I think, is what I was thinking of. So we've got lots of new historical things coming in. We've got the idea of how you consume news by sitting on the floor. But for the second writing invitation, here's a chance to scan the local and national news for a headline that inspires you, or a story that you think is interesting. Great. Oh, Sharon, that's great. Absolutely. You got the idea for sure. So to move to the second part of this, one of the things that I recognize is hard for me as a busy working person in the modern world, and you are busy working people in the modern world, is to have a regular writing practice. And what I've sort of discovered is that the way that I have a regular writing practice is that my regular writing practice is recording on my phone in the car. That's usually the only time I'm still. That's also often the only time I'm alone. And I have some time to think. And it is also the time when I am often listening to the news. I don't know about the rest of you, but I grew up to kind of the constant background of NPR in the car as I was driving. And so that's my background noise as well. So with that in mind, as I'm driving, I am listening to the radio and I have my phone, and I have it kind of the voice record there. So all I need to do is reach forward and touch a tiny button. I don't take my eyes off the road, but I can voice record any quotations or phrases that came through the news stories that I'm listening to that have struck my ear as powerful. If you maybe can't do that, you can also say to yourself, okay, it's 9:30 and I'm listening to NPR and I'm listening to Rick Steves Travel, and that will give you a chance to go back and look at the transcript when it comes up in a couple of days. So I do want you to be safe. I'm not encouraging texting and driving. But I am encouraging using that time that's kind of a downtime, kind of a passive time, kind of a meditative time to tune your ear into language and gather words and phrases. So on March 25th, 2023, my daughter had a sleepover and I ran out to get donuts for the young ladies. And in the 8 minutes it took me to drive to Dunkin' Donuts, this is some of the words and the images that came up by listening to Rick Steves Travel. And the one that really stuck with me was that the person he was interviewing, who had walked Via Angelus, which is a pilgrimage from Cambridge all the way into Spain, that we wish people a safe trip all the time, but that maybe what we want to think about doing is wish people a dangerous trip, an opportunity to step out of your comfort zone, not necessarily to be in mortal peril, but to be somewhere where you are, in fact, maybe on the edge of your comfort zone, on the edge of complacency and seeing the world in a slightly different place. I also love the idea of Martin Luther walking in lousy shoes. And it again, transported me to a historical character and an experience. And that, walking in lousy shoes also seemed to me to be something that might be an interesting subject for a poem. Again, examples, just driving in the car, going from school to Publix. 2 news stories followed each other, one right after the other. One of which was featured a teenager in a refugee camp after the most recent earthquakes in Turkey, which happened in February. So this is in March. And she said, we're trying to live. We've had a lot of deaths, but we can't die with the dead. And that was such a powerful idea and a powerful image. And whether that image is used to understand how to respond to a personal tragedy, or whether that image is used to understand how to respond to the many tragedies in our world, I wanted to give, credit to that insight from that young person. But then also just sometimes when you hear people talk about something that they're passionate about, and their language is just great. And so, just this was the reviewer talking about the final season of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And, the cars were beautiful. And she's so excited about the toasters that she swore. And I've never been so excited about a kitchen appliance that I used an obscenity, but this person did. And then just the people really did dress like that. And the people really did dress like that. Dress like that is both a vague thing, but also a really evocative thing. And again, that seems like a really good first line of a poem to me. Well, they did dress like that. Dress like what? And what do clothes mean? And what do maybe a particular set of clothes mean to you? Or when you look at people in a photograph, what do those clothes mean? And so again, it seemed like a moment. Now, another thing to think about if you are writing about a current event is what is your responsibility to factual accuracy? And I think about The Wreck of the Tay Bridge, which is a poem that is considered to be the absolute worst poem in the English language. You can look it up. I had my students read it out loud when we were talking about whether or not it's possible to evaluate poetry. And to a man and to a woman, they were all like, we don't know what this is, but it's so bad. AI couldn't have generated it. It's awful. So you can go check out The Wreck of the Tay Bridge. But one of the things about The Wreck of the Tay Bridge is that in that wreck where a suspension bridge collapsed, 70 people died. But in order to make a rhyme work, and that's not accurate. So you want to think about what's your responsibility to accuracy, and also what's your perspective? What perspective do you bring to a poem? And so with that in mind, or to a current event, I wanted to show you a reading by the poet Ilya Kaminsky. He is a Ukrainian American poet. He was born in the Ukraine. And he also has, he was diagnosed incorrectly with a cold and that became a medical condition that is, he is got, I think, maybe 82 or so% of his hearing, and that reflects in his speech. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ilya Kaminsky, but he became popular, or more well known as a poet, with this poem, "We Lived Happily During the War." And he is in fact talking about early conflict in Ukraine. And he is Ukrainian, but he is no longer living in Ukraine. And so when he talks about this poem, when he reads this poem, he's reading about this poem in his perspective as somebody who is aware of current events, but outside the physical reach of a tragedy. And so here is "We Lived Happily During the War."
We lived happily during the war. We lived happily during the war. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house, by invisible house, by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in a house of money, in a street of money, in a city of money, in a country of money, our great country of money. We, forgive us, lived happily during the war.
And so it's a thing to think about, your position in the world related to current events and your power in the world to respond to current events. So this is your third writing invitation, which is to make a habit of listening to news stories or other talk radio or podcasts for a week. And I also do this a fair amount. I do a fair amount of walking and running around for exercise purposes. And I do the same thing with voice recording on my phone there that I do when I am voice recording in my car, where I'm listening to something and I am, when words or phrases or ideas kind of catch my ear, I have a really, 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 really long note on my phone. And I am just sort of throwing things in there and always making sure to say the date when I throw things in there and what I'm listening to, so I don't ever inadvertently plagiarize. But it has turned out to be a really useful document. And I just pulled something from 2019 for a small group writing circle with Women Writing for a Change that, if I hadn't written it down in 2019, I wouldn't have had the inspiration in 2023. So I really, recommend this practice a lot. And just trust your ear. It doesn't really matter whether or not you think it's important or whether or not it's the central focus of the news story or the main character. This goes back to the idea of giving voice to the voiceless. Sometimes the minor characters have the most interesting and quirky things to say. But at the end of the week, go back and look at your notes and use those things as the basis for a poem. Another thing to think about is exploring the archives. And so I use the New York Times archives a lot. If you're in Jacksonville, there is the library and they have a huge, huge, great database. You can explore wherever you are located. You can go to your library and find news archives. There's the Wayback Machine that's a sort of a search function, and you can go back in time and look at where things appeared on the internet. But I got interested in Lucien Bloch when I saw her obituary. And when I read her obituary, one of the things that I noticed, and this was sort of the start of the poem, is that she had worked with Diego Rivera. And Diego Rivera had been working on his murals, and it had been decided that his murals were communist and had to go away, and they were going to be destroyed. And the only reason that we have images of some of Diego Rivera's work is because Lucien Bloch, who you don't usually read about in history books, snuck into where the murals were, and while other people, and hiding a camera in her shirt. And she climbed up the scaffold and photographed the murals. And I just love the image of this woman sneaking in with a camera in her shirt to photograph this art that's considered so controversial it's going to be destroyed, and save the art. But along the way of being interested in Lucien Bloch, I went into the New York Times articles or archives, and I found her work. And she was part of the WPA, and she wrote about, and she made work in the women's jail. And I used the news article about that to write a poem about her. This is not the part of her life I thought that I would write about, but it became really fascinating to me to do sort of a deep dive into her life. So this is called Murals for Use, and it comes from a New York Times article from 1935. The Commissioner of Corrections, believing in the value of color and decoration as an aid to the readjustment of offenders, with his idea of transforming reality into beauty and bringing the observers, inmates, at first wary of artists, into consultation. That sounds like work, remarked the inmates, about that which they already knew and understood. The murals on the 12th floor of the Greenwich Women's House of Detention depicting the cycle of a woman's life were never completed due to climate. For 5 months leading into winter, the artist and her assistant were paid only in lunches and dinners. Though a typical New York playground scene, the inmates requested more flowers. The dog following the children came humble from someone's childhood, but the cat in the windowsill assumed herself under the brush of Miss Lucienne Bloch, subheadlined by the Times as Girl Artist the Creator. Her mural swirls with children, runners, swingers, sliders, and rests with children, diggers, builders, collectors of leaves. The inmates, waiting to be told when they have been corrected enough to join the whirling game, the cycles of a woman's life, have become deeply interested in watching the progress of the fresco. Girl artist, working fast before her plaster sets, never to be corrected. A crowd of women behind her, naming and claiming each child as she painted them. And so many of the details in that poem come from the news story about the frescoes that she painted. So here's writing invitation number 4, which is to find a current or event or happening that fascinates you. And for me, that started out with fresco painting. To do a deep dive into the New York Times archives and find an older story about that same topic. You can also keep it hyper-local. There's a couple of websites in town. Jack's PsychoGeo, hosted by Tim Gilmore, is amazing for the deep dives that it does. The Jackson is amazing for the deep dives that it does. But I just Googled dogs in the New York Times archive and got a whole variety of really fun topics. And you can Google just about anything that same way. And then you can go back and forth and see what interests you in the present, what interests you in the past. Another thing to think about is the op-ed section of newspapers. And just as a kind of a sort of a side note and a fun game, another thing that I sort of keep a voice record of are moments when sports commentators or restaurant reviewers or filmmakers or financial analysts use the word poetry as a word to describe, well, anything else but poetry. So this quote comes from an op-ed talking about New York's growing rat and sinkhole problem. And poor Mr. Shoulders, and that's a poetic name if ever there was one, fell into a sinkhole and found himself in a pit full of rats.
Oh,
Which the journalist writing the op-ed and the article about it said that it was an almost poetic representation of the severe hardships posed by the year 2020. And so with that in mind, here's writing invitation number 5 for you to look for stories or events that can stand as metaphors, whether they stand as metaphors for years or whether they stand as metaphors for your life. there they are. So if 2020 is falling into a sinkhole full of rats, I don't know what the news story for 2023 is. And it's possible that just trying on all the different metaphors for what a good news story for 2023 is might in and of itself produce a really fantastic poem. And my last thing to share with you guys is the idea of surveys and studies and using those as fodder for poetry. So I've noticed playing around with BuzzFeed, playing around with Huffington Post, that research is often newsworthy and surveys and studies are often newsworthy. And so with that in mind, those form sort of a large body of news, and you'll see things like, 1 or 2 drinks is good for you until 1 or 2 drinks isn't good for you. Chocolate is good for you until chocolate isn't good for you. This medical treatment is terrible for you. Oh no, wait, it's good. And so you can see that surveys have a tendency to shape belief and also reveal something about our assumptions and our practices. So one of my favorite things to look at is what's called the Harper's Index. And the Harper's Index, if you look at it online, each of those little facts, percentage decrease over the past 5 years in the number of Americans who believe in God, 6% decrease. If you mouse over the Harper's Index, they will show you where they got that information, and you can track back to a particular survey and find out a little bit more about it. But the other thing that I enjoy about the Harper's Index is that sometimes the facts that they have kind of placed together create a kind of an accidental correlation that I think can often be poem worthy. And so the thing that most struck me was the chances that a US adult under 30 believes in astrology was 2 in 5. And so then I started thinking about a poem about how Gen Z views astrology, and that was a good time. And then also when I look at this other survey about sleep, the idea that happier people sleep more. But I also just liked the repetition, the sort of the circular repetition in this sentence. Not only does getting enough sleep make you happy, but being a happy person could help you achieve a good night's sleep. And so there was this sort of cycle of sleep and happiness and sleep and happiness. And it's kind of an accidental pattern, but I think it's an accidental pattern that's kind of worth noting. And I wanted to show you, and I do want to give you a heads up that this particular poem, A, has an obscenity in it, and B, talks to the sort of institutionalized violence that has been directed at people of color all in America. So there's that. But Solmaz Sharif, who is an Iranian American poet, starts out with the idea of studies suggest. And so with that in mind, here's Solmaz Sharif's social skills training. Studies suggest, "How may I help you, officer?" is the single most disarming thing to say, and not, "What's the problem?" Studies suggest it's best the help reply, "My pleasure," and not, "No problem." Studies suggest it's best not to mention problem in front of power, even to say there is none. Gloria Steinem says women lose power as they age, and yet the loudest voice in my head is my mother. Studies show the mother we have in mind isn't the mother that exists. Mine says, "What the fuck are you crying for?" Studies show the baby monkey will pick the fake monkey with fake fur over the furless wire monkey with milk without contest. Studies show to negate something is to think it anyway. I'm not sad. I'm not sad. Studies recommend regular expressions of gratitude and internal check-ins. Enough, the wire mother says. History is a kind of study. History says we forgave the executioner. Before we mopped the blood, we asked, "Lord Judge, have I executed well?" Studies suggest, yes. What the fuck are you crying for, officer? The wire mother teaches me to say, while studies suggest, Solmaz, have you thanked your executioner today? And this is a really brilliant poem for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that it's a brilliant poem is the way it weaves contemporary studies, such as what is the most appropriate thing to say in any given situation, with the much, much older study that was done with baby monkeys, where there were 2 sort of fake monkey mothers in the cage, and one was made of wire and gave food, and one was made of fur and gave nothing. And the baby monkeys preferred the comfort of the fur-covered structure over the one that actually gave food, which says something possibly about our human desire for comfort being more important than our need for food. And just the way that this poem layers those studies in with the speaker's own study of herself and her own kind of emotional landscape. And so this is the kind of thing that you can do if you are paying attention to the information that is offered to you out in the world about what sorts of studies are coming to the fore. And Salma Sharif in particular suggests that it's a good idea to interrogate the language of surveys or the conclusions of surveys, because often, she says, the kind of language that we're being encouraged to use, even though we're being encouraged to use it to maybe express ourselves, Salma Sharif says that we might be being encouraged to express ourselves in ways that make the structures of power around us comfortable, but don't necessarily do anything for us. So there's that to think about. And that is another way to use the constant stream of information that's coming at us to kind of take a little bit of control out of that stream of information and make some sense out of it, and maybe even make some meaning out of it. So those are some of the ways that I, over time, have gotten news from poems, gotten writing inspiration from poems. There you go. Thank you, Shulamit, for Seth Meyer and Tucker Carlson. I'm curious to know, and that's pretty much the end for me and what I have to share. And so I'm curious to know, do you guys have any questions, any comments, any thoughts? Oh, this is one last thing I did want to share. And this actually comes from Robert Blade, who is a Jacksonville resident and was the editor of the Florida Times-Union for a long time, which is our local newspaper, or one of our local newspapers. And this was his advice to journalists. So, and I think it's really good advice for poets. And when I write a poem, I think about these things all the time. So the first one, say it how you're going to say it. But Robert Blade said it. He dropped the F-bomb when he came to talk to my journalism class. But I'm going to say, don't screw up, which means make sure that your facts are correct. Make sure that you know what you're talking about. Number 2, get the dog's name. What the tiny details are is what's going to make your story or your poem come alive. And last but not least, make it sing. So those work for journalists, and I think they work for poets as well. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it for me. Thank you so, so much for coming and hanging out in my obsession. If you guys have any questions or any comments, please let me know. And there you go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, write, send stuff to Women Writing for a Change. You can find them at Women Writing Jacks. They're opening up anthology submissions in May. Just saying, throwing it out there. Jennifer, Darlin, Ruth, do you all have anything you want to say about other submission or poetry writing opportunities? Feel free to unmute and come on in or anything like that.
Hi, I'm Darlin Kuhn. I'm co-director of the Jacks by Jacks Literary Arts Festival, and we will be opening submissions for that in the summer, probably July or August. So look out for that. It's at jacksbyjacks.com. Anna, I have been going through a dry spell, and I can tell you, I can't wait to get off the computer so that I can start writing. I really feel inspired. So thank you so much. These are great ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darlin. I appreciate